I'm Inez Stepman,
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so we've got, as always, we've got a great lineup. We chose from a big list of topics this week. There was a lot going on, but we are going to lead off today talking about the Boulder terror attack by an illegal immigrant and where that all stands in custody. And then we're going to move to talking about the big, beautiful bill again. Elon Musk recently came out, criticized it for not reducing the deficit as much. So there appears to be some kind of rift between Musk and Trump. We're going to go into that. Then, amazingly, in this week, third in the lineup, we're going to talk about the destruction of about a third of Russia's nuclear triad in a drone attack from Ukraine. And then we're finally going to talk once again about a major scary world event. Chinese agents caught smuggling a bioweapon in a type of fungus into the United States. So, like I said, really big topics this week. But with that, we're going to go to Ben first to talk about Boulder.
Thanks, Inez. So another week, and we're almost becoming desensitized to the attacks, either from effectively jihadists or left-wing terrorists or some hybrid of the two. In this case, a tragic attack in Boulder, where an Egyptian national who had overstayed his visa by multiple years, therefore was here illegally, who had entered under the Biden administration, attempted to firebomb a peaceful gathering calling for the release of hostages by Hamas in the streets of Boulder. He had myriad Molotov cocktails, was attempting to burn people alive. 8 people were hospitalized. At least one was in critical condition in the immediate wake of the attack. Apparently, when he was taken into custody, according to the court filings, he said that he wanted to kill all Zionist people, wish they were all dead, totally unrepentant. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he allegedly yelled, "Free Palestine" during this firebombing with the Molotov cocktails. And I think one of the main takeaways from that is that Free Palestine ought to be understood as a call to genocidal jihad. And ultimately, Free Palestine means the elimination of Israel as a state. It's not about Zionism, ultimately. It's about eliminating the Jewish state and ultimately all Jewish people, and then ultimately the Judeo-Christian West. This, of course, follows the murder of 2 Israeli embassy officials in Washington by essentially a left-wing jihadist, effectively, and then the attempt to burn down Governor Shapiro's house several months back. And of course, we can talk about a slew of other violent acts and other acts that, of course, have broken myriad laws in the U.S. really since October 7th, which I think is worth at least taking note of in and of itself, that the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust of genocidal jihadism that the world has ever witnessed, and certainly in modern times has ever witnessed, that the end result is that 2 years on now, we've seen an explosion of Jew hatred, normalization of essentially providing aid and comfort to Hamas and jihadist groups writ large. And that would suggest that from a propaganda perspective, they've advanced significantly, setting aside all the policy knock-on effects of the attack on October 7th. And I think a couple other things worth observing briefly. What we saw in Boulder, of course, in a left-wing locale, and I don't know the gun laws there, but of course, in many of these places, left-wing jurisdictions where the disproportionate percentage of attacks on Jews, and of course, the Hamasnik agitation and left-wing agitation that we've seen over recent years, these are places generally where people cannot defend themselves with arms. I assume Colorado might be a little more liberal, which is to say conservative on guns, but I don't know about in Boulder, and I don't know about in this area in particular. But I think this is a natural consequence of the immigration policy, the open borders policy, that someone like this who shouldn't be in the country is able to perpetrate an attack like this. And 2, when we look back at the Washington, D.C. attack on the diplomatic officials, that is the natural consequence of the sort of unholy alliance between the left and Islamic supremacists. And ultimately, it's about action, and it's about violent action to impose their will and try to ensure that their worldview triumphs at the end of the day. So these attacks, while shocking and outrageous, on the other hand, should not be at all surprising. It shouldn't be surprising that America's streets are beginning to look more and more like Europe's streets. We've had multiple decades now of mass immigration, particularly from Muslim majority countries and countries with disproportionate terrorist populations and disproportionate support for them. And the last thing I'll note on that is go back to the Trump 1 administration. And let's not forget that one of the first policies which came under siege by our ruling regime was the quote unquote travel ban. And it was, of course, panned as a Muslim ban. But what did that say? It said we need to have a freeze on immigration from terrorist dominated nations until we can essentially figure out who is actually safe to be able to traffic into our borders and who isn't. And there needs to be ideological vetting. And that ideological vetting would, of course, include Sharia supremacist beliefs. Obviously, that has not been implemented in America, and this is a natural consequence of it. And I think we're going to see myriad other attacks going forward because we've absorbed massive populations from these countries, really post 9/11, to the tune of multiple million people from Muslim majority countries since that time. So, natural consequence of disastrous policies, and the chickens, unfortunately, really appear to be coming home to roost now 2 years on post October 7th, and after multiple decades of this unholy alliance festering and people like this being able to enter our country freely. So with that, I put it to the group, what's your takeaway on this attack, and what do you think maybe the policy prescriptions ought to be to deal with a disastrous situation that currently persists today?
Well, the Trump administration clearly needs to reprioritize the removal of visa overstays, which account for a significant portion of illegal immigrants in this country, separate from the 10 to 20 million that actually crossed the border illegally under Joe Biden. Notably, this guy was granted a travel visa, which he overstayed, and then he was rewarded with a work visa, even though he had become illegal by overstaying this visa and then overstayed the work permit as well. So 2 strikes on this guy. The Trump administration should definitely be doubling down on getting rid of people who have overstayed their legal documents. And it was great to see that they swiftly arrested this guy's family and are planning to deport them as well. Of course, the media is apparently furious about this. USA Today ran a headline Wednesday morning complaining that the guy's daughter had a dream of studying medicine, but now she's facing deportation. Like, okay, well, there are a lot of Americans who I'm sure dream of studying medicine who have had their spots taken in universities by illegal immigrants who are receiving in-state tuition, and are not the children of terrorists. So it's just wild to see the apologism from the mainstream media after an attack like this, but sadly not surprising. Colorado also, about a week and a half before this attack, the governor Jared Polis signed into law a bill that expanded protections for illegal immigrants, including getting rid of a requirement that they have to prove that they intend to or already have applied for legal status if they are to get things like in-state tuition and driver's licenses and other state documents, and also removed the ability for jail officials to hold illegal alien defendants for up to 6 hours to give ICE the opportunity to start deportation proceedings and get those people in custody. Now jail officials are not allowed to hold defendants for any period of time after they've posted bail or been released on recognizance. So it is very much an immigration issue as well as the radical anti-Semitism issue. Both of those things need to be addressed here. And then, of course, the media coverage of it has just been abysmal.
Yeah, Amber really took a lot of what I was going to say. Same thing. I mean, this is the visa overstay problem that the Trump administration needs to focus on. In a lot of cases, this is a very direct result of policy. I believe this guy also has an open asylum claim, right? An asylum claim that if it gets into court, would get thrown out very quickly. But the problem is getting it into court, and that allows people to stay for a long time while they either do or do not show up. I mean, this is very clearly downstream of, several policy choices that we've made for the past decades, and then very directly policy choices of the last 2 to 4 years under Biden. This guy should not have been in the country. In just about any scenario, any legal scenario, he should not have been in the country to commit this act. And by the way, while we're, sort of keeping score with the media, I was told, a couple years ago that it was crazy to think that our open borders policy and our totally porous system, allowing visa overstays, et cetera, had anything to do with letting terrorists into the country, right? We were told that this was a very crazy and right-wing conspiracy concern, that there were terrorists going back and forth in addition to criminal aliens across our border, or that terrorists might want to use our very lax immigration laws and very lax enforcement to come into the country. I remember Fox News running a series of stories on this, and then those stories were covered by MSNBC and all the usual suspects as like total scaremongering and craziness, right? The fact is that if you never check who's coming in and out of the country, bad actors are going to use that. And it doesn't just mean Tren de Agua. It means, Muslim terrorists as well, with ill intent towards Americans, towards Jewish Americans. So this is just like a very obvious consequence of all of this policy. Finally, just a note on that USA Today article. In that whole fawning interview and piece, they never once ask, if you're going to do a piece on a terrorist daughter and her dreams of studying medicine in the United States, which, by the way, her dad delayed his attack, which he had been planning for a year, so that his daughter could graduate from an American school. If you're going to do this kind of fawning piece, they did not ask her a single question about what her dad had done or the incident that occurred in Boulder. It's all just a puff piece about how she's had her dreams yanked away from her because she's being deported because her dad has committed an act of terrorism. That little part was left completely out of this USA Today puff piece, which is just pretty remarkable, even by the very low standards for mainstream media.
Yeah, it's really incredible that we continue to see terrorist attacks from the Free Palestine left on everywhere in our country. I mean, we had the murders of the 2 young Israeli diplomats in Washington, D.C. We had a terrorist attack in Pennsylvania, and now this one. I mean, obviously, this one has this obvious immigration component, too. We need to enforce our immigration laws. It's about keeping the American public safe. It's about not having people who hate our country in the country. It's a vindication of basically everything that the Trump platform stands for. This guy shouldn't be here. This young woman who is now deported. Well, I mean, she wasn't a citizen. It's not clear if her father was overstaying, then wasn't she overstaying too? None of these people had a right to be in the country. They're all guests. And, when it comes to guests, it's not unheard of to kick the entire family out when one guest in a family misbehaves. Well, this is a pretty dramatic instance of misbehavior. They can all go home. They can all enjoy Egypt. This is a country for people who don't throw Molotov cocktails at Holocaust survivors. You can go do that somewhere else.
Yeah. And with that, I'm going to turn to myself. We're going to talk about the big, beautiful bill. We had Elon Musk coming out and sharply criticizing the bill in Congress, primarily for adding to the deficit and not having enough cuts or implementing enough of some of the DOGE cuts, even though there is a separate precision bill that is allegedly going to implement some of these DOGE cuts. Frankly, I do agree that it's probably unlikely. I mean, no one ever went broke betting against Republicans spending money. So, the critique is at least partially valid, but really interesting to see Trump and Musk break publicly on this. Of course, Trump is a big booster, not just a big booster of the bill, but he gave it that name, that catchy name, right? The big, beautiful bill. And he has been, as I've mentioned a few times on previous podcasts, he has been playing much, much more on Capitol Hill. He has much more of a legislative agenda this time around than Trump won. And I think it's showing up in what we expect to see in this bill. But anyway, interesting to see them break. I would note that this should put to rest a lot of the sort of speculation, largely driven, obviously, by wish casting of the leftist media about how Trump was really like number 2 and Elon Musk was running the country, right? Very clearly, we see who is in charge of this partnership, and it's not Elon Musk, who is not getting what he wants from the Republican Party or from Donald Trump. Having said that, of course, I'm sure they will continue to have a productive relationship, et cetera. In terms of the substance of Musk's critique, while I said I do agree that there could be better there could be better deficit reduction cuts made in this bill. I actually find myself in favor of it after heavily kinds of big Republican omnibus bills in the past. And that's for really simple reason that the substance of the policy of this bill is the best that I've seen in decades. And that's, I'm sure there might be other opinions among you guys, and we'll get to it in a minute, but I think the substance of this bill is really good. And the biggest critique is that it doesn't really knock down the deficit over time by any, like, it's not trajectory changing on the deficit, which is true. Frankly, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to change that trajectory until something hard and fast hits us in the face. Poll after poll shows that Americans don't want to touch entitlements. Donald Trump famously is in favor of Social Security, Medicare, and frankly, it's really, really difficult to make a substantial dent on the deficit with just cutting discretionary spending. So I just don't foresee that dynamic changing. I don't see what would change that dynamic. But on the rest of the substance of this bill, I'm much happier than I have been with previous Republican bills. So obviously there are the tax cuts, including no tax on tip, no tax on overtime. Those are promises of Donald Trump's. There is money for a border wall. There's money for more ICE agents. There are work requirements on Medicaid for able-bodied people, which is like a small step maybe, but a type of step of actually, tightening some of the requirements around a major entitlement on this bill. All the Green New Deal stuff, not all of it, I should correct myself. There a lot of the credits for companies dealing with green energy and so on are on the chopping block in this bill. There's still some left, and there are some critics in the House of that. It's drill baby drill. It opens federal lands once again to American energy production. My favorite, as you know, there's an endowment tax of 21% on university endowments in this, along with the first substantive drawing down and placing some limits around the student loan programs and some responsibility into the student loan programs going forward that have had such an obvious effect of pushing up tuition prices over time. So the first attempt I've actually seen for Republicans to actually deal with the structural nature of the problem, which I think is impressive. And then, money for Golden Dome, which I think is a good idea of Trump's. I mean, money to rebuild munitions and our military strength, which is obviously necessary when we'll get to the second half of this program. Anyway, long list of things. I think on the substance, this is a good bill to me. I'm curious what you guys think about that, or about the Trump-Musk split, or, whether this is going to affect their relationship going forward, or where Musk is going to be in this administration going forward.
Yeah, I tend to take similar tact as you, Inez, which is I understand Elon Musk's frustration, but I do think, politics is often a binary choice, whether that's, Democrat versus Republican, or in this case, big, beautiful bill, or probably just another omnibus continuation of Biden era spending and policy priorities, which is what we saw with the first bill that was passed earlier this year by Congress. So would I love to see more cuts to government? Absolutely. Do I hope the almost $10 billion rescissions bill passes? Yeah, of course. But it's often a game of alternatives. And if the alternative is worse, then unfortunately, sometimes you have to kind of bite the bullet and accept the second option. I think that's kind of what Republicans have agreed to do here. I also am definitely skeptical of the rescissions bill passing because Inez is right. Republicans often talk a big game, but then don't follow through at the last minute, which is pretty typical. Same thing with the move to defund Planned Parenthood, which I believe is a separate bill as well. It's definitely true that if you want to substantially reduce the debt or the deficit, you have to touch entitlements. And that's something that the American people would be furious about. It's something Trump has promised not to do. Even just these small changes to the programs have inspired all kinds of attack ads from Democrats accusing Republicans of cutting Medicaid, when it's really just like a rollback of the limitless expansion that took place under Biden and then at first Obama through the ACA. So I am like 50-50 on the rescissions bill on whether or not it actually gets passed, but I hope that is a sign of things to come. I do think the Elon Musk-Trump relationship seemingly deteriorating a bit is fairly interesting. Musk apparently not spending as much money on behalf of Republicans in the midterms as he originally planned to. We'll see more about what happens there and if this is actually proof maybe of the reporting that Trump and Elon didn't really actually get along all that well inside the admin.
I find the media has wanted to create a wedge between Trump and Musk the whole time. So I find that whole aspect of this annoying and also distracting from the substance and the merits and a narrative that again are basically our enemies in corporate media who hate our guts and want us destroyed would love us to talk about. So let me set aside, whatever personal tiff there might be here. I think we have to ask the question, what did Musk want to achieve by coming out publicly? Is it just that he had a burning desire to say, I hate this and we spend too much and we never deal with the root causes of the debts and deficits? Or is he trying to actually cause some movement in some way? And obviously, that's a pretty risky thing to do when you're talking about blowing up a very divided Senate and House, and which you're going to have a very narrow vote on this ultimately. So I don't know if that was the right tactic to try to achieve what he might want to achieve. I think it would have been better to behind closed doors lay out. You hear things that I think you should do to make this a more effective bill that can actually pass and be viable. That probably would have been a better approach, I think. To the extent he wants to stand out there and kind of scream, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore about this." He's what he can do that if he wants, but I don't know that necessarily advances the ball ultimately. So I think for all the reasons that Inez laid out and people like Russ Vogt have laid out at OMB, the merits of the bill are the merits of the bill. And compared to what it would have been, it's undoubtedly better. And there's some genuinely beneficial things in it. But at the end of the day, as we've said, ultimately the whole ball game is entitlements. The American people don't want to touch entitlements. So, my kind of black pill take is that it's only going to be when it's forced upon us to grapple with these issues that we'll ever deal with them. And that's going to lead to a substantial amount of pain and acrimony and tumult and volatility ultimately. But there's no political will to do otherwise. So it's going to go on until the markets enforce some sort of discipline or it's otherwise enforced. And we're going to deal with the consequences. Our children, our grandchildren, and great grandchildren are all going to be dealing with the consequences of it. Unfortunately, that's where the political system is. That's where the incentives are at this point. So I think, look, to the extent that Elon wants to make the case to the American people and try to influence the American people to actually push for a fiscally responsible government, that'd be great. But I don't know that this was the time, place, or the right manner in which to do it, even accepting the fact that some of the deficiencies he's pointed out are legitimate deficiencies here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to Elon, but I'm also not. I think this was really silly. One, I mean, the most important thing, immigration is simply more important than the national debt. The national debt is like the Republican version of climate change. It's the kind of thing where there's endless doom and gloom about how our country is going to fall. But I'm 39 years old now, and my entire adult life, Republicans have been screaming about the national debt and impending bankruptcy, and nothing happens. And the reason that is because the debt is denominated in our scrip. The debt is denominated in dollars, which we can control. So there's a fundamentally mistaken analogy between like a private business being in this much debt versus the government being in debt in the scrip that it issues. So I think, and moreover, that doesn't mean that we should just be spending frivolously no matter what, but rather it changes the dynamic of the problem where it's more about we don't want to be wasting money. We have to waste some money in order to get the immigration wins we have here. And moreover, there's not going to be any winning on the national debt in a world where our country turns into a third world hellhole. And there are huge cost savings that will result from a world in which we take care of illegal immigration, reduce the strain on public services, reduce the strain on any number of things. So immigration enforcement comes first. It's about who we are as a country. There's a huge amount of money in this bill for immigration enforcement. It will fund the entire wall construction. It will fund a huge, massive surge in resources for ICE. And so it's a really, really good thing.
Yeah, and with that, we'll kick it right back to Will to talk about the attack on Russia.
Yeah, so last week there was maybe not last week, it might have been Monday, but it was, recently, there was a huge, well, not huge, really, a very strategic and surgical drone attack on the interior of Russia, deep into Russia, where Ukraine essentially installing drones into truck beds and trucks unbeknownst to the people who were driving the trucks, launched a bunch of drones and hit Russian strategic air assets, major bombers. From everything, it looks like this was a very surgical attack. It wasn't, some broad terrorist attack. I think there might have been some military service members who died in Russia, but no civilians. And it was a huge blow to the Russian military in terms of, these are billions of dollars worth of assets that got destroyed. Very important assets, obviously, to their nuclear triad, which we'll talk about, but an impressive feat from the Ukrainian government. I think equivalent in, daring and strategic news and the surgical nature of it to what the Israelis pulled off with the Hezbollah pager attack, and also kind of similar sneaking devices well beyond the front lines. I mean, some of the Russian air assets that were destroyed were all the way in Siberia, far thousands and thousands of miles away from the front in Ukraine. So a very, very impressive attack. I saw a lot of talk on Twitter about how this was, a damaging thing that could lead to escalation. And, I thought to myself, like, I don't have a lot of sympathy for Ukraine, honestly. And as a general rule, I think the Ukrainians have taken the side against the Republicans in our domestic politics. I'm not a huge fan for a variety of reasons. But, like, Trump is now the president and has made very serious offers of peace to Russia and the Ukrainians. Russia apparently is the real obstacle to peace at this point, because they're demanding that Ukraine cede more territory than Russia has conquered, which is a very, very aggressive demand. And Trump has truthed out that he's very surprised by how Russia is handling this, and is like, they need to get serious. And so now you have Russia bearing the cost. Like, if you want to be at war with Ukraine and you want to continue fighting and you don't think the current lines are acceptable, well, this is the cost of being at war. Your military assets are legitimate military targets from an opposing military, and there's no complaint. And the idea that Ukraine just needs to be stopped from doing anything inside of Russia is an absurd contention to me. I mean, I don't want them striking Russian cities and killing civilians in Russia. That would be very dangerous. But I don't, the idea that Ukraine can't strike at Russian military bases and destroy planes? Of course they can. It's war. If you don't want a war, make peace. And there's a deal. Trump is waiting at the negotiating table. So I don't. The complaints of the kind of, I guess, people who are overly focused on restraint, I'm not a war hawk here. I would like to see this war end. I wanted Trump to come into office so we had somebody who was more prone to negotiate, more willing to understand that Ukraine was going to have to cede some territory. But I'm not going to cry for Russia getting some planes blown up when they're the ones that are the current obstacle to peace. Biden's not an option anymore, guys. So sit down at the negotiating table or watch your planes get blown up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more sympathetic to Ukraine, but in substance, I agree with everything that Will just said. I think that I want to be very clear, this is speculation on my part. The president denies that he knew about this attack. That being said, last week, there was a Trump truth that the first part of it got a ton of attention from the media because it was like, oh, I'm surprised that Putin would be a jerk in negotiations or whatever. So obviously that set off the media. The last part of it was essentially, you don't know what I'm holding back. You don't know what I'm holding back from the Ukrainians. And then a week later, this happens. This is an attack that took apparently more than a year to put into place. I think it's pretty unlikely that the American president wasn't aware, that our intelligence services weren't aware of this attack. So I tend to think that mocking Trump for the last 2 weeks, as both Putin and Russian media have, and then Medvedev is number two, have been mocking Trump publicly. I think that is about as wise on their part as Zelensky having a fit in the Oval Office and embarrassing Trump. It's been pretty clear that Trump's tone on this has been shifted the last couple of weeks. And I mean, I frankly, this is a target that in some ways helps the United States more than it does Ukraine. Not that it doesn't help Ukraine, but there are better targets in terms of what's being deployed against Ukraine militarily than the strategic bombers that are part of Russia's nuclear triad, right? So at least the initial reports that I saw were something like 41 or 42 out of around 60 strategic bombers of Russia have been destroyed on the ground. It is kind of a Pearl Harbor-esque militarily, operation where they're just, the videos is just drones destroying airplanes on the ground. So I think this is, I was happy to see Ukraine get this military victory. I actually think this brings us closer to peace because it was clear to me that Russia had no incentive at this point to negotiate. Now, Putin is caught between his own people, as per usual, right? He's caught between the reaction of his own people and the ability, but I don't think that Russia not paying an ongoing cost for this invasion actually brings us any closer to an actual negotiated peace. I think this is probably actually better for proceeding towards peace than the alternative. That being said, the first thing that went through my mind where I saw this and the specifics of this attack, which involved all of these drones, low-level drones, but at great distance, very coordinated, very surgical, basically coming out of shipping containers and hitting, catching essentially Russian planes, very important strategic Russian assets with their pants down. And the first thing I thought of is that this would be very, very easy for China to do to us. They have land around our military bases. God knows how many shipping containers are going unexpected, back and forth across our border and placed in various locations in the United States. I would be I'm sure, I hope that people high up in the military are very aware of this possibility and are doing things to prevent it. But then my first thought was, this is the kind of attack that China could easily carry out against assets in the United States.
That's a great point, Inez. And I agree with most of what Will said about this attack and sort of the incentives regarding negotiations. It seems to me that Putin really took for granted that moment in the Oval Office with Zelensky and thought he could kind of push Trump and test Trump after that. I think he really overestimated Trump's posture towards Ukraine and assumed that Trump wanted to have a more isolationist stance when really he was just asking Ukraine to be realistic and to show some gratitude for how much the United States has contributed to the war. And it's not that Trump is totally abandoning the country the way that perhaps Putin kind of hoped that he would or thought that he would after that Oval Office blow up. And now he's perhaps learning after this truth post regarding his attack on Putin and then this attack from the Ukrainians, like, okay, maybe I actually can't push him around as much as I thought I would. So I think this is really an important moment in getting Russia to the table with some actual reasonable, serious negotiating posture as opposed to what they've been doing the last few weeks.
I just want to make something really clear, just as a matter of fact. The White House has denied any knowledge of this attack. Caroline Leavitt, again, came out yesterday and denied any knowledge of this attack. That is the official posture of the White House, although I did find it interesting that she had been giving really long. I was listening to it because I was waiting to go on Newsmax. And I was listening to the whole press conference. She had gave very long and elaborate answers for everything else. When she was asked about this, she said very simply, no, the president did not know about this attack. Next question. And Trump has been very silent afterwards, too. So to me, it seems like a bit of a we didn't know what we did kind of communication to Putin. But that is my opinion and speculation. I want to make it clear that the White House denies this.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, first, I would say it's almost definitional that Putin is more likely to sue for peace to the extent there are real costs imposed on continuing the war. So that is a positive to the extent that this is sort of an escalate to de-escalate while also genuinely weakening Russia and showing off tactical brilliance apparently here. We'll see if there's what the response looks like on the Russian side, to what extent Russia claims that it will or does hold the U.S. culpable. I also have the question, what did we know and when did we know it? There are obviously a couple of potential answers here. One is the administration really didn't know. Another is the administration did know to some extent and is playing coy. Another is that some within the U.S. government and the national security apparatus knew and the administration didn't know, which would be terrifying and scary. We ought to consider potentially all of these different alternatives here. But I think at the end of the day, really what we kind of have to ask is, does this increase the likelihood of a potential peaceful settlement here? To the extent it does, great. To the extent it doesn't, and this spirals and escalates, I'm curious to see what kind of collateral damage the U.S. might face in the response. But that said, I also think you have to weigh, and this is the same that's going to go for Iran and a slew of other threats, to the extent you do have some form of attack that does really degrade capabilities, that obviously makes the ability to counterattack all that less strong potentially. So worth keeping in mind as well. And last but not least, on the China point, which has been raised by some others as well, and I think rightly so. Chuck DeVore had an interesting response to that, former military man in the Reagan administration. He said, first, since Ukraine and Russia are at war, one can assume Ukraine is trying all kinds of things without us hearing about most of the failures. For China to execute such an attack, it must infiltrate containers and keep them hidden until the moment of attack. If they're discovered at any point along their journey, we would then be tipped off that hostilities were about to commence. And then he also cites Russia's, quote, endemic corruption as likely having aided the attack, acknowledging that we have corruption too, but not on Russia's scale. So that said, I suspect there are all manner of ways that we are hugely vulnerable to China. And let's say there was an incursion in Taiwan tomorrow, all sorts of ways that they would sabotage and subvert us there, let alone, obviously, on our own homeland. So I think it's a point well taken. And there are probably ways beyond our imagination that all of our adversaries are thinking about carrying out the same type of dazzling attacks that would neutralize us almost immediately should hostilities commence as well. So point well taken there.
Yeah, with that transition to Amber and another scary scenario that just is pregnant with possibilities that didn't arise with Amber.
Yeah, really a perfect segue regarding the points about China's willingness and ability to do all kinds of nefarious things in order to diminish the influence of the United States. And on Tuesday, the Department of Justice announced that it was indicting 2 Chinese nationals who, in private emails, had pledged loyalty to the CCP for trying to smuggle a fungus into the United States to essentially conduct biological warfare. This fungus causes what's known as head blight, which is a plant disease that affects wheat, barley, maize, rice, and according to the DOJ is, quote, responsible for billions of dollars in economic losses worldwide each year. Some people have been referring to this as an agri-weapon, but I think it's also fair to describe it as a bioweapon because it causes vomiting, liver damage, and reproductive defects in humans and in livestock. So the potential for damage to both U.S. crops as well as human health was massive here if this was not stopped. These Chinese nationals were in a relationship. One of them reportedly worked at the University of Michigan and had access to a research lab. She, it seems, asked her boyfriend to smuggle this fungus into the U.S. and bring it to the University of Michigan research lab so that they can conduct testing on it. The boyfriend had been working on this fungus back in a Chinese university lab as well. So these 2 individuals luckily were caught, but it doesn't take too much imagination to consider what could have happened if they had not been caught. Separately, I also just want to mention that we also had a separate DOJ indictment on Tuesday regarding another Chinese national who had illegally voted in the 2024 election, registered using his University of Michigan student ID, and then fled the country when Trump won the election. So it seems like probably pretty easy to figure out who he illegally voted for. But across these 2 indictments, of course, you have this common thread of Chinese nationals at the behest of the CCP trying to undermine both American democracy, American farmland, American health, all of these things that are hugely important to America's prominence on the world stage and its ability to be a safe and stable country. And this is all in the context, of course, of the Trump administration moving to take away student visas from Chinese nationals. There was a lot of hand-wringing about that announcement. We talked about it a bit on the podcast last week, of people complaining that, well, other countries and China are going to get the best researchers now, completely missing the point that any Chinese national who gets permission to study in the United States gets permission from the CCP. Anyone who leaves China is doing so with permission from the CCP, which means they can be easily compromised. There's been a ton of stories over the past 10 years of Chinese students stealing research secrets, stealing intellectual property, and sending it back to the CCP, and even American professors who have been flipped by the CCP and used their positions of influence to send information back to the CCP as well. So This is a very common practice in the American university system. The CCP loves the American university system and its immigration policies related to it because it's very easy to subvert. And this is merely the latest example of this, but perhaps one of the most alarming because of how severe the damage could have been if these two individuals were not caught.
Usually we have that kind of standoff at the end and final thoughts, but yeah, I mean, like I said in the intro, I think this is one of those near misses that makes you wonder how much else is out there. This could have been devastating to the United States. And then on the final point that Amber was making about student visas for CCP connected students, and realistically, as Amber just pointed out, all students who study in the United States, they're getting permission to do so, and they're being ideologically vetted by the CCP before they come here. That doesn't mean that they're all sort of agents. I wouldn't suggest that, but they are all put through that vetting process, and then they're surveilled here in the United States. One of the underread sort of reported stories, and I remember even when I was on campus, is how much the local consulate and embassy of China surveils and keeps control over its students. And in fact, something that really, ticks me off as an American, they try to extend that surveillance to American, like Han Chinese citizen, people who are citizens of the United States, maybe have been here several generations, right? They try to extend that kind of control to other Han Chinese who are actually just Americans, usually with failure, but it really offends me that they are trying to extend, for example, the censorship of the CCP over American citizens. But in any case, this is a longstanding relationship. Often the Chinese American associations on campus have direct contact and are taking direct instructions from the consulate and from CCP officials. I've seen some really dumb comparisons online about this move to suspend student visas and accepting scientist defectors from the Soviet Union, which is just wrong on every possible ground. One, there's a huge difference between somebody who comes here vetted by the CCP and is permitted to come and study in the United States, and somebody who defects and leaves the country never to return in such a public way. So that's one that's an obvious difference. And the second thing is, of course, those defectors were themselves carefully surveilled by intelligence services, exactly hoping to avoid the situation in which they were double agents, right? And then third, and finally, the Soviets did steal nuclear secrets from America. So at the end of the day, all of this, even a much more stringent policy didn't actually work to prevent nuclear secrets from getting to the Soviet Union from America and through a network of spies. So I just think that's just top to bottom a really dumb comparison we should not be making.
Yeah, we don't need more Chinese students coming into the country. I mean, this is just another reminder. It's just all this is a very, very good reminder. China is the primary adversary of the United States. They've been unbelievably nasty in terms of espionage, IP theft, you name it. And we just need to be extraordinarily careful. I used to think that the Chinese farmland issue wasn't a big deal. And I mean, the funny thing is we just talked about how actually, yeah, it is. They shouldn't have any territory near Air Force bases because who knows what they might do with it? Who knows what they might do in the event of an attack? And I think there's a problem, I mean, that we've already talked about, which is this connects back to Harvard and the universities. We don't need these people funding our universities. We don't need our universities dependent on Chinese money. And we don't need them dependent on Chinese money that furthers Chinese influence.
Our enemies, and especially the CCP, exploit our freedoms, our openness, and our naivete. They know exactly how to play us. If you look, and I've long argued, when you go back to the opening of China, and obviously the business aspect of it, that commerce was really the key influence operation of them all. And that extends, of course, to the universities as well, where you have the foreign nationals who pay full freight, and you have Chinese nationals and entities who provide billions of dollars in funding, and we don't have a lot of transparency into it yet, into particularly our elite schools as well. So we're talking about several 100,000 Chinese nationals, I think, annually per year at U.S. institutions. It only takes a small fraction engaged in very hostile activities to do incredible damage. This is before we get to the professors as well here, of course. And I think it's worth noting, just to echo Inez's point, any Chinese national attending one of our schools, we ought to believe that they could be weaponized. Again, it doesn't mean that they're all engaged in nefarious acts, or that they want to engage in nefarious acts. But just like by law, any Chinese business entity can have a civil military hybrid sort of purpose and use, and they have to provide intelligence to the CCP to the extent the CCP asks for it, and they can be weaponized on national security grounds. Same, obviously, for Chinese nationals who attend our schools. Not only do you have the Chinese associations that surveil those students, but then you have efforts of Chinese nationals themselves to surveil other Chinese nationals and to try and coerce them. And of course, Americans of Chinese descent as well, to Inez's point, on campuses. So this is a massive point of vulnerability. It's been exploited to the hilt for years. The bioweapon issue itself, we could talk a lot about in terms of the fact that if you go back and you read the sort of infamous Unrestricted Warfare book by PLA generals, and you think that at least there's a partial chance that that is the way that the PLA thinks about the world and the CCP more broadly thinks about the world. Of course, biowarfare is a massive, massive focus of theirs, and it's terrifying and potentially cataclysmic here. And we don't even have to talk about COVID, but obviously you can look at that as potentially one manifestation of their entire strategy. And of course, that was built in part on university research and relationships with U.S. institutions as well. So I think this is a useful reminder of the fact that there are myriad ways that our adversaries try to exploit what we consider our benefits of freedom and openness. And the loopholes, to the extent you'd even call them loopholes, which is an understatement, need to be closed. And the last point I'll make on that is, with the courts thwarting the administration, for example, when it comes to foreign students at a Harvard, for example, ultimately the courts are going to be looked upon as having blood on their hands potentially when you have policies that are thwarted and Americans end up dying as a consequence of them. Rightly or wrongly, because judges are going to say on the merits, this is our view, this is why we have this decision. Same thing with the Alien Enemies Act, and you have a terrorist foreign national here who's an Egyptian. Obviously, the Alien Enemies Act has not been invoked to go after Muslim terrorists in the country. But nevertheless, you can foresee a scenario where the courts are going to hold up certain policies that are necessary to defend our national security. And as a consequence of it, you're going to have Americans who bear the brunt of it and face the consequences of it. So there's a legitimacy of the judiciary, and the judiciary is an institution here, aspect of this that I think is also relevant and is also going to loom over these issues going forward.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and turn to final thoughts if anybody wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I was originally going to talk about the failure of the Supreme Court to grant cert in the Snopes case, which was a Second Amendment case about whether or not Maryland's ban on AR-15s was constitutional. After Heller and Bruin, that struck me as very obviously, yes, you can't ban AR-15s because they're a weapon in common use, and AR-15s are the most commonly owned rifle in the country, and yet the Supreme Court wants to let it percolate for another year or two. Meanwhile, they're willing to drop everything at a moment's notice to protect illegal alien gangbangers from being deported. I really do think the Supreme Court needs to get its priorities in order if they want to retain their legitimacy among conservatives.
So my final thoughts are on the FBI's Catholic memo. There's a report from Chairman Grassley that indicates that it was not isolated to the Richmond field office, as Christopher Wray tried to claim in testimony to Congress. It was distributed to 1,000 FBI agents across the country. And the FBI was actually working on a second memo before the backlash came from the whistleblower sharing that first report to the public. They referred to radical traditionalist Catholics, or radtrads, which seems to be a common theme of people who come after like traditional conservatives, which is that they make us sound way cooler than we are. Like, yeah, rad trad, awesome, sounds great. But they compared tenets of the Catholic faith, like traditional family structures, to like radical Islamist ideology. It's just, everyone should read the full report. It's actually insane. But one other thing I did want to mention really quickly in final thoughts, since we covered this earlier in the program, is that Trump actually just released another truth about the situation with Ukraine and Russia, saying he was on the phone with Vladimir Putin for an hour and a half and did not feel that the call led them to immediate peace, saying that Putin did say very strongly that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. And he said they also discussed Iran and that they're in agreement that Iran cannot get nuclear weapons. So that's the latest update on that story we talked about a little bit earlier.
So my final thoughts, I have two. One is that Hegseth over and is doing some really great jobs symbolically and substantively. He has followed up a bunch of reorganizations, including getting rid of DEI in the military, getting rid of a lot of things that did not have to do with military readiness, harmonizing some of the standards and making them uniform in terms of what's required to join all of these different military branches. And all of these things combined with the Trump election have had a very positive effect on military recruitment, which was a big problem under Biden. So that's all great. He's copying it off with a symbolic thing, which I think is very important, which is they're looking into renaming the ships that were named in sort of the peak woke era, 2020 to 2024, including a ship named for Harvey Milk, which is particularly offensive, but also ships named for Harriet Tubman. And I can't remember what the third one was. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, despite the merits, like obviously these three people have radically different merits, right? Harriet Tubman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Harvey Milk, in my opinion, in that order, are sort of either individually meritorious or not, or worthy of being, having a statue, or in this case, a ship named after them. But I actually think we need to deal with this the same way that the left dealt with it, which is they didn't look at the individual historical merits of any of the figures that they tore down in the riots in 2020. It was a symbol of essentially regime change and a hard break with America's past. And in the same sense, I think all of these obviously politicized namings should be reversed, sort of blanket, without a big back and forth. I'm not going to get into 50 disagreements with people about the merits of naming a ship for Harriet Tubman and how she, while meritorious, maybe she's not the most, important person we could have named. Maybe we only want to name ships for presidents or generals. That's one, that's all very interesting, but that was not why the names were changed. It wasn't because we suddenly realized that Harriet Tubman really, really needed a ship named after her. It was part of this cultural revolution, and it was done as a symbol. And I think it should be undone as a symbol without regard to the particular merits of the people involved in any, basically the way that they dealt with tearing down statues of Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln without any regard to the fact that those two were oppositional in the Civil War. They both were symbols of America. And that was the problem. So I think we should deal with this stuff the same way. Just one sentence, unrelated. Trump has just put out a great new federal sort of application process, merit-based application process. The federal hiring freeze is going to be unfrozen shortly. And so there's this new application that, for example, asks applicants to write 200 words about how the Constitution informs their desire to want to serve as a civil servant in the government, and also asks how they would implement one of Trump's executive orders, because this is for policymaking positions, and literally your job will be to implement the president's executive orders. But of course, the left is going nuts over this. I think it's great. We haven't had a real merit-based civil service exam since 1981. This is not really a real merit-based civil service exam because that is prevented by various Supreme Court cases. We can get into that another time. But in any case, this is better than what was in place before. It is more merit-based than what was in place before. And it importantly screens for people who not only have civic feelings and then want to actually help restore the Constitution of the United States. It also specifically asks them, are you going to implement the elected president's policy? Because as we've seen from polls that Reuters put out, or not Reuters, Rasmussen put out a couple weeks ago, 75% of government federal employees say that they will replace the president's judgment with their own, that they will refuse lawful orders from President Trump. So that's very important to screen out for. So anyway, good work on that.
Sort of tangentially, building off of Will's points, I thought it was interesting that President Trump lambasted the conservative legal establishment over judges broadly and the advice that was provided him during his first administration. I think that augurs really positive things for what the judicial nominations are going to look like this time. And separately but related, I'm doing an analysis right now, which will probably come out at some point at Real Clear Investigations on forum shopping and the composition of the courts. And it's really fascinating just as a factual matter. I think if you look at the breakdown of district court judges, active district court judges nationwide, there's something like a 60-40 Democrat-Republican split in terms of who the presidents were that appointed these people. And that's before we even get into where the cases have been shopped, which are almost universally disproportionately Democrat-dominated districts under the Trump administration to thwart the agenda. So part of this is going to be there's a needed stronger judges this time around, and it's going to be fascinating to see what the administration's criteria for that is and what the nominees look like. But again, it also comes down to the Supreme Court. And will the Supreme Court rein in judicial tyranny from the lower courts? And I continue to be very pessimistic about that. We shall see. Probably the biggest test thus far coming up when the court, likely, I think, before the end of this month, rules on the birthright citizenship cases, which were really about the legitimacy of universal injunctions. And of course, forum shopping itself is one of the symptoms of universal injunctions because people will look to shop to a judge most likely to give that relief, which is to say, to stymie, sabotage, and subvert the president's policies as applied to anyone everywhere by way of those injunctions. So let's see where the court comes down ultimately on that issue. And then we'll see where it goes on the merits of a whole slew of issues currently being litigated right now.
And with that, that does it for our Action Pack week this time. We'll see you next week. On behalf of Ben, Will, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.